series called Growing Pains. Just as we are expanding as a community, we also recognize that as individuals, when we grow, when we evolve, when we change, there is always a certain level of pain and discomfort that comes along with that change or that transformation, right? Think about those moments in your life when you begin to see things in a new way, when your outlook on life bloomed and expanded and evolved, right? Was it pain-free, right? Was it always easy? No, these moments that define us are often the difficulties, the things we overcome, the odds that we face that are often not in our favor, right? The challenges. This is what really adds and imbues our life with meaning. Sometimes we turn to memoirs or biographies to get inspired, right? And we're probably looking for a life that's full of challenge and difficulty, that's really going to inspire us for whatever we're going through. Am I right? Imagine if you purchased a memoir, a biography, and, throughout this entire person's life, it began easy, and then through the middle section, it was continued to be easy, and then at the end, it was easy still, right? It was easy the whole time. It would be like reading the book Nothing Happened, the story of Steve. I'm sorry for any Steves out there. It's not about you. But some books you can judge by their cover, okay? This one's being honest, right? But it would be 500 pages, and it wouldn't really communicate anything to you about the meaning of life. You'd probably get a refund for this book. It's not getting adapted into a movie that is going to win any Oscars, right? Because what we know is that a life fully lived is a life that's going to have setbacks, a life that's going to have heartbreak and disappointment. Yet what's interesting is that when we are in the disappointment, the difficulty, the challenge, it can be hard to recognize that it's one of those moments, right? It can be hard to look at it in the moment and say, right, this is one of those times that's actually going to add meaning and define my life in a beautiful way. And I'll go even further. When it comes to the story of your life and my life, it's often the wounds and the scars and the mistakes and the wrong turns that in many ways crack us open to reveal who we truly are, to reveal our capacity, to reveal our capability towards empathy, love, and connection. And so what I hope to really share today in this message is a perspective that really all of us with the growing pains that we've all experienced in our lives, we are all something called wounded healers. How many of you have heard this term before? A wounded healer is an archetype. And if you haven't heard that term before, an archetype is basically a universal pattern that we can observe often in people, right? We see certain characteristics, certain tendencies that show up in story, and they show up in our lives. We tend to embody these things. And so what you might find is that whether it's in fiction or in your life, in reality, you may see time and time again that there are individuals who have incredible healing capacity, right? Whether through their words, their actions, the work they do in the world, they have this incredible ability to be healers. And yet what you'll probably also find is that these very same people have many scars, that they have gone through a certain degree of suffering and difficulty and growing pains along the way. This is the wounded healer archetype. Maybe even now you're already thinking of some wounded healers in your life or some ways in which you have been and are a wounded healer. What I find so compelling about this phrase, wounded healer, is that coming out of my mouth, it can sound sort of like a paradox. Because we tend to think that our failures, our shortcomings, our wounds, we tend to think that those things disqualify us from being of service to the world. When in fact, I believe that it's those very things that might qualify us, that give us the perspective and the empathy and the ability to connect with others. Kahlil Gibran, the great mystic poet, once said that out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls. The most massive characters are seared with scars. Life is going to throw the growing pains at us, right? And we're going to make some mistakes. We're going to have some missteps along the path of life. As we're growing, that's part of the pain. We're human, right? We're going to fail. It's also very likely that we are going to experience many things that happen in our lives that are out of our control. Many of us have already, we can look back at our life history and we can say there were a lot of things that happened. It wasn't my failure. It wasn't my mistake. Things happened to me that I had no control over. These are our wounds, and yet they also can be a superpower if we allow that perspective in. That these very things can ground us into connection with each other, into connection with our planet. Maybe it's these very things that allow us to connect to our deeper purpose in life. And so, in order to communicate this, I want to introduce to you a character from Greek mythology who in many ways is an ancient embodiment of this archetype. This character is named Chiron, Chiron. And Chiron was a centaur. Now, how many of you remember what a centaur is, right? Waist up, human body, waist down, the body of a horse, right? And if we're going to talk about a centaur, we really should raise the most obvious question of if a centaur were to wear pants, how would they wear the pants? I'm going to go through a couple options, and I want you to just take these in, right? This is option A. We have option B. Oh, that's option, okay, hold on. We need to back up here. I need to give you a good look at this. Okay, this is option B. Then we have option C. Okay, and then this is option D. All right, now I'm going to go through them again. I want you to take a vote, right? I want to just use your voices. All right, how many of us think that a centaur would be option A? No? Okay, no one. Wow. All right. What about option B? Pretty weak as well. Okay, a little bit. Option C? Medium. All right, let's see. Option D? Wow, okay. All right. So we had, most people think option D. All right, I can see that. So this will be our Chiron for today, all right? So this is Chiron, and Chiron is not only a centaur in Greek mythology, but Chiron is also an immortal, which means he cannot be killed. Chiron is also a mentor and a teacher to many, holds great wisdom. And in fact, he is teaching his students, he is teaching some warriors, and there is an incident in which he is wounded with a poison arrow. Now, Chiron is in a bit of a predicament because he is immortal, which means he cannot die. This poison cannot kill him, but he is also not able to heal himself of the poison. And so he is stuck in this terrible limbo state where he is suffering with the pain of the poison arrow, but it does not kill him. And so this pain, this wound lingers. And I think about us, and I think about our journeys, and how we all have wounds that in some way, they stick with us, right? Maybe these wounds go back to childhood. We know that by the time we reach age 7, that there's certain, we are incredibly impressionable, and that things that happen to us in the first 7 years of our life, rewire our brain, right? And so perhaps for some of us, these wounds happen very early in our lives. Perhaps we look back at our journey of life and we think of these wounds as maybe certain failures we experienced, mistakes we made along the way. Perhaps what we might consider our wounds are things that are actually physical wounds or things that are otherwise physical, feel as though they're physical limitations. But I think we all on some level have a certain wounding that we bring into our lives, right? I look at my own journey and I was thinking about talking about some of the religious conditioning that I went through growing up as some of the wounding I experienced, because I know that many of you can relate to that, but I've also shared that quite a bit. And so I'll go back even a little further. Growing up, and particularly growing up in church, I looked around me and everyone, my age when I was a kid, it seemed like all the other kids my age grew up in families that were, this picture perfect idea of what my religion was calling for. Right? Everyone just was kind of the ideal sweet family, or everyone grew up in a family where their parents were pastors. And I thought that was like important, that, like the only way for you to be like doing the right thing was to have a family that also exhibited all the same characteristics. And yet that wasn't the home that I grew up in. I grew up in a home that had a certain degree of dysfunction. I grew up in a home that was, non-traditional in many ways. For most of my upbringing, I grew up in a single parent household that was so different from what I was observing around me. And so I thought that there was something in me that was disadvantaged from the start. I thought there was something in me that was broken, especially as I compared myself to the people around me. I was carrying this wound, feeling like I didn't belong, like I wasn't good enough. And the thing about these wounds, whatever it is for you, like Chiron, they stick with us on some level. That even if you've gone through an incredible process of healing, which I hope many of you have, that we still carry the scars from the things that we have gone through. And yet here's what happens to Chiron that I think is so incredible. Chiron is suffering. He is experiencing pain like he has never had before because he has been impervious to it up until now. But yet this increased pain and increased suffering actually increases his empathy. He is able to reach people and connect with people that he had never had before because he understands their pain, because he now finally feels it. And so he is able to fully become the healer that he never could be before, because of, not in spite of, but because of his wounds, because he can relate, because he can connect. And it reminds me of this wonderful Rumi quote. The wound, Rumi says, I really need to get my clicker fixed. As many of you who have been with me the last couple, we'll see. I'm going to come up. I've been joking around. I'm going to have a clicker that's like connected by a cable, like a telephone that just like really, anyway. As Rumi says, the wound is the place where the light enters you. The things that we so often want to keep hidden, they actually, through those places, shines the light of the divine, right? Shines something transcendent. If only we could have this perspective. How does this work, though? You might be wondering, what does that even mean for the wound to be the place that the light enters? What does that mean in a practical way? I'll tell you what I've seen. I'll tell you what I've experienced. I've experienced people in this very room with these stories. People who grew up in unbelievable poverty, who have since become some of the most generous people I've ever met. The wound is the place where the light enters. I've met people who, in their childhood, when it comes to their parents, people who experience abandonment, who experience neglect, who experience perhaps just not feeling safe and loved by their parents, and those people grow up to become some of the most safe and loving and accepting and welcoming parents I've ever met. And of course, we already listened to a story of someone who, even through a physical disability, shared gratitude for the perspective that it had given him, shared gratitude for the increased vantage point, this spiritual altitude that it gives him, right? And perhaps you know people in your life with the same type of story. And we see it all the time in culture, right? Like, think about the incredible musician Stevie Wonder. And he has this unbelievable quote when he talks about his blindness. He says, "Shortly after my birth, I became blind. Now that was a blessing because it's allowed me to see the world in the vision of truth of sight, to see people in the spirit of them, not how they look, not what color they are, but what color is their spirit." That's a wounded healer. I think about Helen Keller, who had this unbelievable perspective. The best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt with the heart. Their wisdom, their perspective on life didn't come in spite of the challenges they faced. It came through the challenges they faced. So friends, when you and I look at our wounds and our scars, which, by the way, come with the territory of life, right? We're human, we're here, which means we're gonna get some wounds, we're gonna get some scars along this journey. Maybe we can shift our focus from seeing them as the problem, right? Seeing those things as that which stands in the way of a full life. And perhaps we can shift our focus to start to see these things as a solution, right? Maybe not for us alone, but maybe for others. Maybe it's a way that we can be of service in the world, because these wounds increase our vulnerability, particularly if we own them, if we look at them within a sense of appreciation and understanding. They increase our vulnerability. And our vulnerability is what helps connect us to one another. Our vulnerability makes us relatable. Think about the people in your life that you are the closest to. I'd venture a guess that it's the people that you feel that you can be the most vulnerable with and the most raw with. And it's clear then that when we lead with our vulnerability, that is how we create connection. And so Chiron is able to do this. He's able to relate and to empathize because of his pain. I think about my own life. I think about, as I shared, having an upbringing that didn't fit into what I thought I was supposed to have looking around. And yet now I realize, wow, I'm grateful for how that shaped me. It actually has increased my ability to connect and to relate and to be vulnerable, right? That our scars, that our wounds, that the darkness that you and I have walked through, it's actually what allows for our ability to connect, to share, to be of service, to heal. That our pain can also expand our capacity. And I think about this community, a community that was started by a group of people who looked at what organized religion was doing in the world and who had felt pain and wounding from organized religion, from how religion had functioned and is functioning in this world. And from those wounds, they said, we're going to create something different, right? That this community was founded by people who were wounded healers, because we all are. And yet, to be able to create and build and grow from that place means not being ashamed anymore, coming out of the darkness, coming into the light, not letting shame control us. Henry Nouwen, the Christian mystic, has this quote about this very thing. When our wounds cease to be a source of shame and become a source of healing, we have become wounded healers. Can we step out of the darkness and into the light? I like to think of it as though, we all on some level have experienced some form of a prison, right? We've been stuck, we've been trapped in things that feel like they have this incredible hold on us. And maybe you've been lucky enough to feel as though you have escaped, that you have broken free from those chains, from that prison. And to be a wounded healer is to say, I'm going to return to that very same prison to help others out. And it's only possible because you know the territory, you know the escape routes, and you are courageous enough to return, that you can enter into the very spaces that were wounding for you. And though you may still hold the wounds, you can also begin to free others from them. It's having the courage to, rather than to live in shame, to own what you've gone through. Because we recognize that healing doesn't necessarily mean solving. It doesn't necessarily mean curing. That healing doesn't always mean the thing just disappears, right? Physical, emotional, spiritual. That in many cases, healing means making peace with the experience, making peace with life, forgiving life for what it has thrown your way. And from that perspective, I find that the greatest healing that we can experience in ourselves is when we can start to be a source of healing for others. That we can turn around and say, hey, this is what I've experienced. These are the gifts that have been given to me. This is the healing that I have been offered, and I am going to offer that to others. Can you go ahead and advance to the next quote for me? Pema Chodron says, only when we know our own darkness well can we be present with the darkness of others. See, this is something I think we often miss, because we think if I'm wounded, if I'm experiencing some level of darkness or I have some sort of darkness in my past, then I can't be of service to others. I can't help others. But in fact, what if that's the only time we can be helpful? When we can look at our darkness, right? Not pretend it isn't there. Not pretend that we are free of wounds or free of scars. But in fact, to look at it, to be present with it, to own it, and then to let that be the very source of life from which we can help other people. Because like Chiron, these wounds aren't necessarily going anywhere. I think of some really significant stories from some of our faith traditions, right? Like in the Old Testament, there is this story of Jacob who, experiences this dark night of the soul. And in that very night, he wrestles with God. And he survives, but apparently God has some serious wrestling moves because Jacob gets his hip dislocated, and it's said that really for the rest of his life, he walks with a limp. And yet, he is also irrevocably transformed by that moment in a powerful way. Right? Sometimes we go through these incredible transformations, and yes, we carry the scars of them forever, but we wouldn't trade them. I think about Jesus who, as it's written in the story, after he dies, when he appears to his disciples in his resurrected form, he still carries with him some scars. Not to gloss over the pain of his death, the suffering, but to integrate it, to own it as part of the story, embodying that wounded healer archetype. I think about Ram Dass, who is someone who I draw a lot of inspiration from. I think he was a wonderful teacher. And in the last, years of his life, he had this stroke which had rendered him, unable to move in most capacities and having incredible difficulty speaking for someone who had made his living speaking, who was, that was what he was known for. And so his ability to speak had slowed down quite a bit. And yet he allowed the stroke that he had to become his greatest teacher. And for so many of us, particularly if you followed him in those final years of his life, perhaps his most profound teaching came after the stroke and what he was able to communicate to the world about living with and embracing and understanding the suffering. See, friends, we can heal, but we're always going to carry the marks of what we've been through. And perhaps we might begin to see those marks as gifts, right? As gifts because they remind us of our strength and what we can overcome. Or maybe they also remind us of our weakness. And how many of us know that sometimes that's also a very powerful thing to be reminded of? Sometimes our wounds remind us and keep us humble, which, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, a humility that actually grounds us, connects us to each other, connects us to the earth. And so we realize that maybe the growing pains aren't ever going to go away fully, right? Maybe the healing journey never really ends. I don't think it ever really ends, at least in this form, in these bodies, in this lifetime, right? How many of you would be a little thrown off if you were talking to a friend, you're catching up with a friend, and you were like, hey, how you been doing? And they're like, oh, hey, last Tuesday, my healing journey ended, right? I'm whole now. I'm done. Work's over, right? No, it'd be weird. Because it's a journey that we're always on, and we can own that. But I do find that we often can get to these points where we've healed to a certain degree. We've healed enough that we can then turn around and start being a source of healing for others. We can become that wounded healer archetype. A friend of mine has this great metaphor about restoring cars, and I'm not a car person, so I might butcher this metaphor. I mean, I drive one, but I don't know how any of it works, right? So, but he basically says this. He says, imagine like you're going to restore this beat up car, right? And in the very beginning, there's a lot of work that needs to be done just to get it running. You're probably gonna have to change a lot of parts just to get it running. And in many ways, this is us, right? That we often show up to the spiritual journey with a lot of pain, with a lot of wounds. And sometimes it just takes some time for us to heal just to the point that we can kind of get running, right? But he says, look, once the car's restored, once the car's running, yes, you're still going to have some maintenance that you're going to need to do from time to time. Yes, you're still going to need to change out some parts and do different things down the road. But ultimately, that can be dealt with because you're back on the road. You're back running, and those things kind of, we'll handle them when they come. And I think in a lot of ways, we're the same, right? That when we allow ourselves to go on a healing journey, we reach a point where though we recognize that the healing's never completely over, that we're running, we're restored, we're back on the road, and we can start to become a source of healing for others, which again, in turn, continues to work on us as well. So it's having experienced death and rebirth in your life, right, which I know most of us have, and through that, you can then walk with people who may be in situations where they're only seeing an ending, right, but you can also point out a beginning. You can point out new life and growth that might be beginning to show itself. It's having lived through things that broke us, but we also recognize that they broke us open. And then we can help others see that when they're experiencing heartbreak, when they're experiencing loss, that there might be some opening and new birth that is occurring as well. See, friends, using this word healers, I think, is interesting because really, we all are responsible for our own healing. And so when we think about a healer, in many ways, we're talking about someone who holds space for others to do that healing work. When you think about the healing that you've gone through in your life, you can probably recognize that you did the work, but there are others that maybe guided you, held space for you, walked alongside you. And so as we've been having this conversation, I wonder if there are people that have come to mind that you were reminded of, that did that guided you, that were a safe space for you, that really held you as you could begin to heal inside of yourself. And I imagine as you're thinking of those people, if you were to take a closer look, what you'd probably realize is that those individuals had scars of their own, right? Those individuals had wounds. And perhaps they figured out how to turn that into the place where the light shone through them. Perhaps that was the very thing that connected you to them in the first place. So friends, the wounded healer, it's not a celebration of all the suffering you've gone through, but it is a celebration of who you've become, how you are able to help and be of service to the world. Like Chiron, realizing that it doesn't have to just be a problem, but it can be a solution. It can be a very source of healing for others. Maybe it's taking the perspective that we live in a universe in which nothing is wasted, that even your pain can have a purpose, even your scars can be the very place where the light shines through. And all the while, you continue to heal as you participate in the healing of others.